All right, let's continue on here with the themes of reconciliation and forgiveness and apology for acts of violence as a means of stopping the transmission of violence and the cycle of violence, and the idea that violence maybe is an entrenched cycle which is hard to eradicate or get out of cultures and communities. First of all, I'd like to emphasize how the idea that changing behavior, I spoke about in the last video, changing behavior is one of the keys to stopping the transmission of violence. We saw that funny example of Slutkin's experience in Africa, and with AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, they're trying to change people's sexual behavior, and they said that the best way to do this is for people to imitate peers and succumb to social pressure to do what people around them are doing. In other words, you can't tell someone to change their behavior by telling them they're not going to change, but they will change if you set up a good model and a good example for them. The line 209, which refers to the idea of punishing, which is one of the big problems in our society, is violent behavior, criminal behavior. We always punish, put someone in prison for violent behavior. But he says here on 209, punishment doesn't drive behavior. Copying and modeling and the social expectation of your peers is what drives your behavior. So we do what our friends do. And of course, the funny example here is someone's not going to use condoms if you tell them to use condoms. They're going to use condoms if they find out their friends are. So they're more likely to. Okay? So that change of behavior is a key component to this thesis of Kotlowitz and Slutkin's ceasefire program, changing behaviors. Okay, so we look at line 314 here on the topic of reconciliation. Kotlowitz writes, I once asked Hadenbach if he has ever apologized to anyone he hurt. We were with one of his old friends from the street who started guffawing as if I had asked Hadenbach if he ever wore dresses. I'd done it twice, Hadenbach told us, quickly silencing his friend and saving me from further embarrassment. One apology was to the brother of the man whose lungs he'd punctured. The other was to a rival gang member he shot. So this is hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to ask for forgiveness. It's hard to apologize. But Hadenbach, who's done, I think they said 8 years in prison, who's come out of prison to help young people to stop acting violently, he admits that he'd apologized twice. What that takes is humility and to be humble. And this is a really tough issue. We looked at this issue a lot in the Shakespeare play Hamlet. The reason why Hamlet felt so much that he had to commit the violence against Claudius was his honor. Okay, it's really hard when your honor is involved, your pride is involved, to take a step back and decide not to act violence when you've been wronged. Torres says here, after he came up from Texas to Chicago to the funeral of his nephew who'd been shot, when his brother told him not to get back at the guy who killed his nephew, he says, quote, in 328, I felt like a punk. I feel shameful. For people's honor and their mentality, if they back away, they sometimes feel like a punk. So this, they feel weak. So this SAT phrase here from the footnote, cognitive dissonance, comes in here. It's important. Cognitive dissonance is important to be able to live with contradictory ideas in your head. The idea of your honor, and then losing face if you don't get back at someone. Okay, if you can still feel okay with that and keep your honor at the same time, you've maintained cognitive dissonance in your head, which is tough to do. To feel two your pride and your honor, and then your humility and your peacefulness. If you can feel those at the same time and not choose to act out on your pride and honor. Tough thing to do. So finally, there's a couple of ideas here that the interrupters with ceasefire have been talking about. Again, on page 389, there's small steps you can take. He calls it, George Kelling calls it the broken window theory of fighting crime. Address small issues quickly. He says the public, on 371, the public health model will be fully effective only if coupled with other efforts, including more creative policing and efforts to get gang members back to school and to work. Okay? So do small things like getting people educated, getting people to humble themselves will help stop the violence. Little things, again, like going to the car wash if your car has been egged, instead of going out and getting even violently at whoever egged your car. Okay. Finally, if we look at 390, this looks like it. Although there's all these great ideas for solutions, it looks like it might be a problem that's really tough to solve because of the poverty reality. In line 401, we see anti-poverty measures will only work if you treat violence, okay? But at the same time, it would seem intuitive that violence is a result of economic deprivation. The relationship is not static, so it's constantly shifting. Poverty causes violence, violence causes poverty. And what you end up having in communities with a lot of violence is this trap that you can't escape. And we see it in the final paragraph here. Slutkin equates living in a violent, poor community to living in a place with a pandemic or an epidemic going on. People get scared. Those who can move out to a safer place move out. Those who can't are stuck. And you start putting people away, incarceration. You start closing places down, community centers, local services and resources are shut down because of the violence, and people are pushed out of town. So it's interesting in this time we're living in now that we see how much fear and sickness is starting to shut the economy down and causing people to be afraid and afraid of other people even. So yeah, it's a tough thing to do, to block the transmission of violence, but I hope you learned a couple things from this article by Kotlowitz. It is a fascinating article, and it'll be an assignment on this in the next couple of days. Okay? Take care.